After the end of the Second World War, Blackpool once again began to flourish as one of the best holiday destinations for British families looking to enjoy the many pleasures that this little seaside town had to offer. A chance to put everything behind you and spend quality time the traditional British way. Fish and chips by the sea, spending time at the fairground and eating too much candy floss, building sandcastles and enjoying donkey rides on the beach. And in 1953, time back then seemed to be much more simpler. Life, love, and happiness. But 1953 wasn't all merry-go-rounds and ice cream. It saw a series of high-profile executions, the most noticeable one being John Christie, and the horrors that unfolded at the infamous 10 Rillington Place. It also saw arguably the biggest miscarriage of justice in the case of Derek Bentley, and bizarrely, Blackpool would hit the headlines for all the wrong reasons too, with the most unlikely of candidates, that being 46-year-old Louisa Merrifield, the Blackpool poisoner. Louisa was born Louisa May Highway in 1906 as part of a large family based in Wigan. She was the youngest surviving daughter of 7 children. In 1931, she married Joseph Ellison, and by all accounts, the couple were somewhat happy together, or at least content. They had 6 children together, with 2 of the youngest dying just after a year. In 1946, all 4 of Louisa's remaining children were taken away from her, and life at home seemed to be crumbling before her very eyes. After she was convicted and imprisoned for ration book fraud and refused to pay the £10 fine, which equates to around £400 today. As a result, her children were fostered to separate foster parents in Wigan and Liverpool. But in 1949, only a few years after her release, her husband Joseph died of acute infective hepatitis. Swiftly after her husband's death, Merrifield subsequently tied the knot and married 78-year-old Richard Weston on the 6th of February 1950. Weston was 35 years older than Louisa, and strangely, he died just 10 weeks later of a heart attack. There's no evidence to suggest that Louisa killed her first husband, but the second marriage was marred by strange decision making, and it aroused some suspicion. After confessing some years later, Louisa claimed that she'd set the bed so that when he got onto it, it would collapse, and it did so, and it was the shock that killed him. In 1950, she married Alfred Merrifield, a 68-year-old widower, and now her 3rd husband in just 10 months. And this is where the story of Louisa's life began to take a much more darker and sinister twist. She was now in Blackpool with Alfred, and over the course of time, she had over 20 jobs in just 2 years, from domestic cleaner to carer. But ultimately she was either fired on the spot or left by her own accord, due to being caught red-handed several times for thieving and helping herself to the treasures of the vulnerable and elderly, who she apparently cared for. And already we begin to see another side to this crafty, slippery-fingered woman. She was known for her outrageous comments when drinking with her friends in the pubs at Blackpool, passing devious remarks about other people and making outlandish statements to her close-knit friends. She was a compulsive liar, a braggart who had a loose tongue when under the influence of alcohol. But whilst out job hunting yet again, Louisa and Alfred spotted an advertisement for an in-house carer position at 339 Devonshire Road, offering lodgings in return for acting as a carer for 79-year-old Miss Sarah Ann Ricketts, a vulnerable woman who desperately needed care. As her eyes opened wide, with a deep intake of breath, Merrifield suddenly saw an opportunity of a lifetime and a chance to put all the money worries behind him. But little did she know, her actions that day would write her name into the hangman's history books forever. Mrs. Ricketts lived alone in an affluent and prosperous part of Blackpool. Her bungalow was a pride and joy, but behind the door held a dark and macabre past of its own. Ricketts had married twice in a lifetime. Both her husbands had committed suicide. Both died in the kitchen, and both gassed themselves to death with the cooker. She was described as being a difficult person to be around, cantankerous, bad-tempered and argumentative. But when the Merrifields knocked on the door that day, they were welcomed with open arms by Mrs. Ricketts, and the three of them seemed to hit it off. Mrs. Ricketts had a few odd habits, and one being a diet, which seemed rather strange. She enjoyed eating sweet jams straight from the jar, eating them by spoon. She accompanied the jam with either rum or a bottle of stout. Given Louisa was now officially a carer, and living at the house with Alfred, she decided to cook her more hearty meals, to Ricketts' dissatisfaction, and by doing so, it seemed to form the base for the first real bit of friction between the two. Ricketts could be awkward, very set in her ways and stubborn, but had she met a match with the wicked and crafty Merrifield that was now living under a very roof? Not long after they moved in, Mrs. Ricketts decided to change her will, and she said to Louisa, "If you see me right, I'll see you right once I'm gone." But little did she know that the fire had been ignited in Merrifield's head, and that one comment alone would feed the fire within her mind to get rid of poor Mrs. Ricketts. She'd be entitled to a fortune, including a beloved bungalow. Not long after the Merrifields were written into the will, Louisa started to be more domineering, and the pair clashed daily, with Mrs. Ricketts threatening to take Louisa out of the will. The house was tense to say the least, and the friction between the two was almost at breaking point, with Alfred stuck in the middle, trying to be the peacemaker, but inside Louisa's mind, she was plotting and calculating how to discreetly get rid of the weight around her neck. Louisa decided the time had come to show Mrs. Ricketts who really was the boss, and she knew that she had the power over life and death of the frail old woman. The time had come to stage the death of Mrs. Ricketts. Louisa firstly called out the doctor to arouse suspicion that Ricketts was in poor health. And once the doctor gave her a thorough examination, he deemed her in good health for her age, to the dissatisfaction of Louisa. A few days later, she called him out again, and by this point the doctor had started to lose his patience with her. Again, he deemed Mrs. Ricketts in good health, but Merrifield thought she'd done enough to arouse concerns over the old lady's health, as it would have been logged back at the doctor's surgery. The scene had been set, and now it was time to carry out this wicked and terrible deed. Louisa Merrifield's weapon of choice was poison. And if you use rat poison specifically, the victim will suffer a horrible and excruciating painful death. Surprisingly, the use of poison by female killers is quite a popular one, not just in the United Kingdom, but globally. And back in the 1950s and 60s, poison was relatively easy to get hold of. It didn't matter how big or strong somebody was. Once the correct amount had been consumed by the victim, the outcome was always going to be the same: death. You didn't have to use violence or physical force to overcome somebody. It could simply be drip-fed in small doses over a period of time to not arouse suspicion, as the victim's health would slowly decline and they would die under less suspicious circumstances. But in the case of Merrifield, she either didn't have the knowledge and know-how to administer a subtle and discreet ending to the old woman, or greed had consumed her whole being, as she cowardly concocted a potent and lethal dose of poison in one sitting. Mrs. Ricketts' vice, as we all know, was jam, eating it straight out the jar with a spoon, and craftily knowing this, Louisa Merrifield manufactured the correct amount of poison and discreetly blended it into the jam, knowing too well it would only be a matter of time before Ricketts' sweet tooth would start to itch. And on the fatal night, the sweetened poison went to work almost immediately. As the poison took hold, Mrs. Ricketts found herself in a world of pain, as she will have experienced extreme stomach pains, the precursor to an agonising death. When the doctor discovered that Mrs. Ricketts had died, he was immediately suspicious, and he also recalled the conversation he had with Louisa just days before. And that being said, he refused to sign the death certificate, and a post-mortem was ordered. When the post-mortem reports, it's abundantly clear that poor Mrs. Ricketts had been poisoned. With suspicions aroused, it wasn't long before the coppers came knocking. And the police launched a search of the property, but no sign of poison was found in the bungalow. They searched high and low, even in the garden. But when the police visited the local chemist and asked if they'd sold any rat poison recently, it emerged that Louisa Merrifield had in fact been to the chemist and purchased a tin of Rhodey, a well-known rat poison that contains phosphorus. And so the net began to close on Louisa May's plan to inherit the beloved bungalow. In the wake of the post-mortem, police made the discovery that Louisa was boasting the night before down at the pub, informing her friends that her employer wasn't dead, but she soon will be. And it was only within a matter of weeks before Louisa May and her third husband were charged with the murder of the old woman. Yet the police and the prosecutors were initially perplexed, as Merrifield didn't really fit the profile of your typical murderer, and it was her husband Alfred who the police were initially most interested in. Yet as the attention shifted to the couple, they soon began to hone in on Louisa May, and it became immediately clear that she was a woman who was financially a mess and was in desperate need of money, which prompted the MO and ultimately drove her to murder. In the July of 1953, the couple appeared in a show trial, which caused a national sensation, and especially in the heart of Blackpool. In court, Louisa seemed as if she wasn't taking it seriously, and strangely enough, it appeared like she was enjoying the limelight. On the other hand, Alfred seemed to be dumbfounded, and the jury actually referred to him as a tragic simpleton. Alfred was very deaf and wore hearing aids, but the judges seemed to think that he played on his disability, as he was also acting in a strange manner, as if he didn't quite know what was going on. But in his own way, he was quite a shrewd man, and he knew how to portray himself as someone that didn't know what was going on. Louisa attempted to suggest that she had nothing to do with the murder, but ultimately, the evidence was overwhelming. The jury took only 6 hours to convict her of the murder of Sarah Ann Ricketts, and as a result, she was condemned to death by hanging. And who was the person to carry out the executioner here, you ask? Well, it was no other than Albert Pierpoint, arguably the most well-known hangman in the world at the time.
As soon as I see that everything is ready, I pull the lever, and the prisoner falls through it, and it is all over in an instant.
On Friday the 18th of September 1953, at 8 o'clock in the morning, Louisa walked bravely to the gallows, stone-faced, and she refused to take off her glasses. And with a deep intake of breath, she fixed herself up and walked to the designated area. The rope was placed around her neck, and she ultimately met her maker. In Albert Pierpoint's own words, he said the hanging went very well. She said goodbye to the death cell officers, much better than he imagined. Whilst Louisa was sentenced to death, on the other hand, the judge and jury passed sympathy with Alfred, and some believe that the tragic simpleton might not have been as docile as it would have seemed. It's been suggested that Alfred must have known what was going on, and that he too played a role in the death of Mrs. Ricketts. However, he did quite well out of the ordeal. The poor and confused old Alfred still inherited half of Mrs. Ricketts' bungalow. After all, he was in the will, and lived at the bungalow on Devonshire Road for some years. He was suddenly quite aware and astute when Mrs. Ricketts' daughter fought a legal battle against him for the house, wherein he managed to win a sum of money before moving out in 1956. As the months and years rolled on, Alfred was a regular at Blackpool's beachfront sideshow, talking about the case in which his wife was a convicted murderer. He made money giving the clothes away of Louisa to the Blackpool Chamber of Horrors, and they had a waxwork made of him and his wife, and continued to profit from the case. Before he died in 1962, aged 80, He told a crime writer that the old bugger would have poisoned me too if she hadn't have been caught. Perhaps Alfred had been the evil one all along. It's hard to believe that the story of the Blackpool poisoner seems to slip under the radar when it comes to British true crime, but undoubtedly it's etched itself into the history books forever. And like most of us that visit Blackpool, we think of the seaside and the pleasure beach, but in the eyes of Louisa Merrifield, she saw an opportunity for greed, money and murder. And ultimately, justice was served with a sprinkle of sugar, or should I say, a hefty dollop of jam.
But if we just pan in, just past where that van is, you'll see a white bungalow. Now that is number 339, and that is where Louisa Merrifield took the life, very cruelly, very cowardly, took the life of Mrs. Ricketts back in the 50s. And it's sort of, it holds a bit of a macabre history before Louisa actually killed Mrs. Ricketts, because both of her husbands, Mrs. Ricketts' husbands that is, both of them actually took their own life. They committed suicide and they took their own life by gassing themselves in the kitchen, which I find really, really strange. But that house right there where the dog and the guy is, that is the house of horrors basically. And it became the focal point of a massive, massive murder. You know, it gave Blackpool a bit of a bad name, and it put Blackpool on the map for all the wrong reasons, really. But it sort of sends a shiver down your spine knowing what went on in that house, you know. Louisa was calculated and very cruelly and cowardly, sinisterly even, made this concoction of rat poison and mixed it in with the jam, thinking that she would get away with murder so she could literally get her hands on the bungalow that you see before you. But it's very, very strange being on this row and knowing that that was the focal point of a story which would not only, you know, a poor woman lost her life, but Louisa actually was hung for what went on in that house at the hands of Albert Pierpoint.